Hello, Kanan Gonzalez here, and this video I want to address the topic of the Sabbath, and it's answering the question, is the Christian obligated to keep the Sabbath law? And so the answer I'm going to give is no. The Christian is not obligated to keep the Sabbath law. Number one, the Sabbath law was given to Israel as a nation. It was given to Israel as a nation alone, and as the Lord told Israel in Exodus 31:16, He said that the Sabbath day, that Israel keeping the Sabbath day, would be a sign of the covenant that He made with Israel. And also, when we think about the Sabbath day, it's hard not to notice that the Sabbath day was a day in which God rested from His work after He created all things. And that's exactly what He says to Israel in Exodus chapter 20 verse 8. That's exactly what He says to Israel. He's giving them the command to keep the Sabbath and telling them how they should keep the Sabbath, right? And who should keep the Sabbath. It is not just the person in the household or the homeowner, but also the servant, even the stranger, right? The passerby. And He commands Israel to keep this law, right? And He gives them a reason, right? This is actually I believe the first time He actually gives the reason for keeping this commandment, keeping this law. And the reason He gives Israel for keeping this law is because in it, or on the seventh day, the Lord rested from all His work. And so the Lord wanted Israel to also rest on the Sabbath day, to be free from any and all labor, to rest on the Sabbath day. Why? Because God rested on the Sabbath day. And so when you think about it, the Lord is saying here, I want you to be free from all work, from all labor, so that you can remember or think on my power in creation. All right? Think on my power in creation. And so the Lord gave the Sabbath not for Him, not for the Sabbath, but He gave the Sabbath for Israel. And think about what good that would do for Israel, right? To be free from all labor on the seventh day, to think on God's power in creating all things out of nothing. Next up, I also want to show you that God at another time in Deuteronomy 5:15 gives another reason for keeping the Sabbath, or another reason for God commanding Israel to keep the Sabbath. And what's beautiful is that in Deuteronomy 5:15, the Lord tells them to remember, that you were a slave. Remember that you were a slave and how I brought you out of Egypt, and with all my power, right? And then if you notice, right after He says, therefore, right? Therefore, I gave you the Sabbath. For that, or you can reword it and say, for that reason, I gave you the Sabbath. What was the reason in Deuteronomy 5:15? The reason is because He wanted them to remember what God did for them in bringing them out of Egypt, out of delivering them from slavery, to remember God bringing them salvation. He brought them salvation. He saved them from their bondage and brought them into, and eventually brought them into a land, as God said, flowing with milk and honey. So let's pause real quick and think about the two reasons why God commanded the Sabbath to take place. The first one is because God rested from all His work. When He's talking about His work, He's talking about His creation, right? His power in creating all things, all living and non-living things, right? And then also you have a day to remember God bringing salvation to Israel, bringing salvation to a people who could in no other way bring salvation to themselves. Okay, and God, and once again, think about the blessing that this is, that God would command the people to do this. He says, "I don't want you to work. I don't want you to. I don't want you to do any labor, any labor. All I want you to do is think on my power in creation and my power in salvation." And what joy does that bring? What joy does that bring? To sit and think on all that God has done for me. One who was a slave. One who was a slave and who desired and cried out for salvation and couldn't give it to myself, but God did. God brought me salvation. And so that's the beauty of the Sabbath. Let's move to the New Testament. Right, let's move to the New Testament and see, yes, we see within the confines of the Gospels that the Jews and Jesus himself were keeping the Sabbath, which is appropriate. Why? Because those Jews and Jesus himself was under the Old Covenant, keeping the law. When you move on, let's say in Matthew chapter 11, you hear Jesus saying this, right? He's crying out in Matthew chapter 11, where he addresses the people of Israel. He says, "Come unto me, you who labor, and I will give your souls rest." Now that's interesting, right? And we have to understand the context of his words. Jesus is saying, "You who labor, come unto me," right? And what are the people laboring in? Now this is good, because this is an oftentimes, quoted a lot verse, right? We hear this specific verse in Matthew 11 quoted a lot in churches, right? Where the preacher would say, "Come unto me, all ye who labor," but you don't know what it means to labor, right? Jesus in this context, right, is speaking of people laboring in the law. People laboring in the law to build up for themselves a righteousness and know that they fail every day. Know that they fail every day. And it's a burden. The law was a burden since it was given to Israel. It has been a burden. And it was broken the day it was given. And so the Lord is saying, "Come unto me, you who labor, and I will give you rest." Okay, so people are laboring in the law, right, which includes the Sabbath. And Jesus said, "Come to me that you may rest." And it's interesting because what you see in the Old Testament is God telling the people to rest from their physical labors, right, from their, regular duties, right, jobs and chores and cooking and things like that. But here Jesus is saying, rest from the law. Rest from the law and come to me for rest, right? Stop your labor in the law and come to me for that rest. That's amazing in itself. Also, another thing that comes to mind is when you consider Colossians chapter 2. Let me get the direct verse. Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. And before verse 16, to give you some context, Paul is discussing what Christ has done to the believer. He has, brought you back. He has raised you to life, circumcised the heart. You have been filled with in God, meaning you have been made complete in God. In other words, you have everything you need in Christ. You have been perfectly provided for in Christ. And then in verse 16 he says this, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in question of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or, listen to this, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. He says, let no one judge you. Let no one pass judgment on you in questions of, among other things, he says, the Sabbath. Let no one pass judgment on you in regard to the Sabbath. Meaning, let no one judge you because you're not keeping the Sabbath. And this is Paul, a Hebrew, one who was under the law, one who was a teacher of the law. And Paul is saying, let no one pass judgment on you if you're not keeping the Sabbath. And notice why he's saying this. In verse 17 he says, these are a shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. All right, the substance belongs to. So this is what he's saying. He's saying that those elements of the law, right? The food, the drink, the new moon, the festivals, the Sabbath. He's saying all those things were but shadows. All those things were but shadows of things that Christ himself would perform, right? In other words, he's saying all those elements that I just mentioned, they all pointed to Christ. That's what it means that the substance belongs to Christ. Those elements pointed to the work of Christ. And listen to this. If that's the case, if those Old Testament elements pointed to Christ, do we not have something better? Do we not have something better to behold, to set our minds on? Why do we think highly of the Sabbath day when the Sabbath was merely something to point to something great? That's all it was supposed to do. Just like the sacrifices, just like the sacrificial system pointed to Christ. The book of Hebrews, if you haven't read it, read it. The sacrificial system pointed to Christ. It was only a shadow. Those animals, the blood of those animals, they merely covered sin. They didn't take it away. But Christ being our sacrifice, our perfect, sinless sacrifice, accepted sacrifice, he took away sins. He's greater than the animal sacrifice. And so, just like Christ being greater than the sacrifice, Christ is greater than the Sabbath. How so? Remember, God commanded Israel, rest from labor, to think on my power in creation and to think on my power in bringing salvation. When you look ahead, after Christ came and died and rose again and ascended, he has now given us a rest from working the law, a rest from trying to acquire a righteousness of our own to be accepted by God, and to just and to find our rest in Christ, because he fulfilled the law for the unbeliever, for those who would come to him. And so we can rest from all of our works of righteousness, and to daily think about Christ's power in bringing salvation to his people. It's amazing. Christ bringing salvation to sinners is a greater display of God's power than God delivering Israel from Egypt. Isn't that amazing? God raising an unbeliever from the dead and breathing life into him, giving one a new birth, a new creation in Christ, right? One being being a new creation in Christ is greater than God's creation of all the universe in the Old Testament. Because all those things in the Old Testament point to Christ. And the person being created anew is a work of Christ. The person being brought salvation is a work of Christ. And so I'll say this. Are you free to keep the law of the Sabbath? You're free to keep the law of the Sabbath. You're absolutely free to keep the law of the Sabbath. But I would say do not keep the law of the Sabbath as a means of accruing righteousness or staying saved or staying in God's grace. The scriptures don't allow for that to happen. The scriptures don't allow for you to have that mindset where I have to do this or else God is going to punish me. You You don't have anywhere in the scriptures that allow you to have that. Romans 8 speaks loud of God's love for you, right? Nothing can separate you from the love of God. And so, yes, you're free to do it. But here's the thing. Every day can be the Sabbath. In Christ, every day can be the Sabbath. I can rest from my works of righteousness. I can rest from trying to atone for my sins. And I can think on and rest in what Christ, the power of Christ in bringing forgiveness of sins and taking away my sins and in bringing about in me a new birth. That's amazing. I hope that if you listened and you watched this, that you would just rest in Christ. That is the Christian life. The Christian life is resting in Christ's righteousness for you, believing that Christ's righteousness is for you, and his death is for you, and that in coming to Christ, you have been given a righteousness, and your death and sin have been taken away, and Christ nailed those things to the cross, no longer having to fear it, but already at the point of faith being granted everlasting life. That's it for today. If you have any suggestions on any other topics to film, please let me know. I hope you're satisfied with this. Until next time, God bless.